Good morning. This is Janae, and I've recently posted some binding instructions on my website, and I've had a lot of people say, well, why don't you show us a video so that we can see how the binding is actually done in person. So I'm finally getting around to doing a video, and I want to show you this really quick how to put binding on. Actually, it may not be real quick, but bear with me as I show you this process. So the first thing I did was I cut 2.5-inch binding. I've got this little tiny quilt that I'm showing you on, and what I did is I first sewed on one side of the binding and I cut it flush with the quilt top. I sewed on the other side and cut it flush with the quilt top. I flipped the binding to the outside, and then I sewed on the last two sides, and they're flush with the binding, top edge and bottom edge. So the thing I really want to show you here is that you will have a little bit of raw edge right here on all four corners. So there's about a 1/2 inch to 1 inch of raw on the four corners. When you flip it over to fold the binding to the back side, you are going to just want to remember this crucial step, and that is to tuck the raw side in first. So let me show you as I pin this side on what that's going to look like. So I am actually going to hand sew this binding in place. So I stitched the binding onto the front side of the quilt, and I'm flipping it around to the back side, and I'm going to hand stitch it in place. So I pinned a little bit on this side, but then I'm also going to go over here and pin on the other side so that my corner will fold in nicely by itself. Well, actually not by itself, but it'll be easier to fold it in when it's already pinned. So here's my little bit of raw edge, and I want to fold that side in first, and then I want to fold this side up and over, and then I'll pin it in place. I will do that again on another corner so that you can see what that looks like. With my particular binding method, I end up with square corners. I don't particularly like a mitered corner, so that's another reason why I like this method. The other good thing about this method is you will not have to come around and meet the ends up when you're doing continuous. So to me that's a little bit trickier. This way just seems very cut and dry for me, very simple. So on this corner I'm going to tuck my raw edge in first. I will pull the finished side up and over. I'm going to pin in place, and there I have a nice square corner, and hopefully you can see that really well on the video. So once I get it all pinned, I'm ready to start sewing. And when I have a big bed-sized quilt that I'm doing binding on, I do not pin the whole thing. I probably will only pin about 6 inches at a time, do my whip stitching, take my pins out, and then pin as I go. One of the things I wanted to share with you is if you're going to machine stitch your binding on for the last step, you will want to put your binding on to the back side of the quilt, and you'll want to bring it up and over to the front side of the quilt, and then you will take your sewing machine and you will stitch right along the edge of the fold. Now here's the trick that I have figured out works best. I am not trying to catch the binding on the other side. My stitch is going to be about 1/8 of an inch in from the binding. So on the back side of the quilt, you will only see a stitch line about 1/8 of an inch from the binding. So on the front side of the quilt, my stitch line will be a nice straight stitch along the edge of the fold. Anytime you try to match that stitch line up on the front and the back of the binding, it's just not going to look good. It's probably going to look a little wavy and you're going to be discouraged with it. So if you try to get it on the inside of the back of the quilt, it looks just fine. And nobody's going to squabble about it if you show it to them and you don't point it out. Because likely if you have machine quilted the top of your quilt, it will just blend right into the quilting that's already there. I'm going to set this aside and I'm going to show you how to whip stitch your binding in place. So on this little piece here, I have already stitched around and I'm coming to this last edge, this last side over here, and I've just taken a bigger size needle than normal and some heavier thread. I have some that's actually a hand quilting thread, and I really like it because it's already a little bit glossy or waxy, and so it goes through the fabric so nice and smoothly. And so I've threaded my needle with a pretty long length of thread, and I'm just whip stitching this in place. So I hope that you can see it, but what I'm doing is I'm coming up and taking a tiny little bite out of the binding fabric. I'm going straight down with the needle, pivoting my hand, and coming up about 1/4 of an inch away from where I last was. So I'm going straight down, I'm pivoting, and I'm coming up. Now remember, when you're hand stitching your binding on, you do not want to catch the other side, the front side of the quilt, because you don't want to have little tiny black stitches on the front side. So I'm being very careful to not catch the front of my quilt. I just want you to watch as I finish up this last side, and then I'll turn the corner, and when I do, I want you to see how I'm finishing off the very corner. So I'm just whip stitching this down. Now the whole goal of doing this stitch on the binding is that you want it to be a blind stitch, so you don't want it to be shown. So match your thread color with your fabric of the binding. So I'm to the corner. I'm just going to take a couple stitches, and I'm going to take my pin out, and I'm actually going to just stitch a couple stitches to the very corner, keeping in mind that I still want those to be hidden. And then I'll just stick my needle in and go to the corner of the binding on the inside, and then I'll stitch around to the end. Just tuck in any threads that might be poking out, and at the end there I've got a thread that I want to hide, so I'm just gonna tuck it in, and when I get to the very end, I'm going to show you a little tiny knot that you can make that will be hidden, hopefully. It's always the goal, right? And so I'm just going to go down into the backing fabric and also the binding, take a stitch, and then I'm going to loop. Before I tighten it up, I'm going to put my needle through, so that makes a little knot, and I'm going to actually do it again. So this is a very, very tiny, tiny little stitch. You might have to get your reader glasses out for this, but once you're done, then stick that in there, that needle in there, pull it tight. I'm going to snip it close. smooth it out, and there I have my binding on my little tiny quilt. I think it might be a mug rug or something like that, but anyway, I hope that helps in your binding adventures, and email me if you have any questions. Bye for now.